Hi, 7th grade. Today we are continuing with the last nutrient that we were talking about. We discussed proteins, we discussed carbohydrates. Today we're going to talk about lipids. And lipids is basically another name for fats. And we know that that lipids are made up of the monomer triglycerides. But we're going to get a little bit more into it, and we're going to talk about different types of lipids and what exactly they are made out of. So there are actually two different kinds of lipids that we are going to discuss in this class. So there's phospholipids, and then the other one is going to be right up here, fats and oils. Okay, there are other kinds of lipids, but for this class, because of the different ones that we're going to talk about, mainly because we're going to be talking about the cell next chapter, and phospholipids are very, very important, and we're going to discuss exactly why right now. So, phospholipids is the structure that makes up the cell membrane. And we kind of briefly talked about the cell membrane in the beginning of the year. The cell membrane is kind of like the boundary that separates the inside and the outside of the cell. Now, the cell membrane is made up of this very specific type of lipid called a phospholipid. The reason it's a phospholipid is because there's phosphorus within the compounds. We're not going to talk too much about that. I am going to post an image onto Google Classroom where you can actually see the structure of the phospholipids and how they kind of come together, okay? I'm going to erase this now so I have a little bit of room to draw it out for you. But basically what a phospholipid is that it's made out of two different parts, okay? So we have what's called the glycerol head, and I'm going to draw it out like a circle, but in real life it's obviously not a circle. And then we have these two squiggly lines here, and this one has two. We're going to talk about fats and oils and how they are a little bit different, where they actually have three. But this one have these two, what we call fatty acid tails. And one year, one of my students actually pointed out that fatty acid tails actually spells fat, and asked me if that's where they got the word fat from, which is possible. I don't know, because fatty has the word fat in it too, so I don't know. But these are the fatty acid tails and the glycerol head. Now, there's enough light there. So now the way that this works is that the fatty acid tails are basically attached to this glycerol head over here. And the way that they attach is through dehydration synthesis, okay? So this entire structure is what we call the polymer of the lipid, okay? Whereas the different individual parts would be the monomers of this lipid. And then they come together in fat with dehydration synthesis. And I'll actually, I'm gonna post on Google Classroom the actual image. Because these phospholipids and triglycerides, they don't actually connect with each other. We're gonna have some of them when we create these structures. They're gonna be near each other, but they're not actually connected as a compound, okay? And we're gonna talk about that when we discuss the actual structure of the cell membrane. Now, what is very important about the phospholipids and triglycerides in general is that there is two different characteristics to them. There's the glycerol head and then the fatty acid tails. Fatty acid tails. Now, the glycerol head we call hydrophilic, which means that they like water. Hydro is water. A phyle is something that likes something else, okay? And we're going to talk about that hopefully this year. Extremophiles, right? They're types of organisms that like very extreme environments, okay? Hydrophile is something that likes water, right? But then we have, there's the hydrophilic, and then there's hydrophobic. And this word phobic, right? Phobic means to be afraid of, right? So it's afraid, right? It's kind of quote unquote afraid of water, right? Or dislikes water. So we have a part of this that likes water, and we have a part of it that dislikes water, okay? And you guys should be familiar with oils in general, right? If you have oil and water and you put it together, right? They don't actually come together. They separate, right? And the reason for that is because of this hydrophobic aspect to lipids, to fats, okay? That they actually don't like the water. And that's going to be the tails. The tails really don't like the water, but the glycerol heads do like the water. So why is this important in forming our cell membrane? So what happens is, if you think about, I'm going to get another color, the cell membrane, right? We know that the cell membrane is this boundary that separates the inside and outside of the cell. So if this was my cell, have all this stuff in here, right? So there's this boundary, this portion over here called the cell membrane, and that is made up of primarily phospholipids. There are other things on the cell membrane as well. We're going to talk about that too. Proteins, and as you know, the carbohydrate chain as well. That's going to determine the identity of the cell so that our bodies are familiar with what the cells are. So how is this phospholipid layer, this cell membrane, how is it structured? And the way that it is, if we see we have the structure here, the glycerol head, that is hydrophilic, the fatty acid tails, which are hydrophobic. And basically what's going to happen is it's going to arrange itself in this kind of circle. And I'm going to just draw a bunch of the heads, and then I'm going to draw the tails so that you see how this structure is going to form. And by the way, notice that these circles, like I said, they're not actually attached to each other. They're just near each other, okay? What's really nice about it is that they're really flexible. It could really move very, very well. And that's very important for the cell membrane to be able to be flexible, right? Letting things in and out, right? If you actually feel our skin, right? It's got this soft texture to it. It's not so rigid. So we have these phospholipids, and on the phospholipids, I'm going to draw out the fatty acid tails on all of them. So each one of them is going to have the two tails that are going to come out. Phospholipids specifically have two. We're going to learn about how triglycerides, and you even hear that in the word triglycerides, have three fatty acid tails, but phospholipids specifically have two. Now that we've kind of drawn the cell membrane, now we know something about the phospholipids. We know that the fatty acid tails don't like water, right? Do not like water. The glycerol heads like water. Well, we know something about the cell. We know that inside of the cell, there's water, right? We know that the cell is approximately 70% of water. We also know that approximately outside of the cell is 70% water. There's this balance between the inside and outside of the cell of 70% of water, right? And it's that balance that kind of keeps things stable. And, you know, if it does kind of go out of balance, right, there's going to be movement from high concentration to low concentration. But right now, just focus on the fact that we have water on the outside and we have water on the inside. Well, the glycerol heads here on the outside, they're very happy, right? They like the water. They're chilling, they're good, everything's stable, right? However, the tails on the inside, if you look at the fatty acid tails on the inside, they're not happy. they're really not happy. They're actually kind of unstable. It's chaotic, right? They want to move away from the water. So think about these tails that are kind of squiggly, right? What are they going to do? They're in this water and they're hydrophobic. They are afraid of the water. They don't like the water. So what are they going to do? They are basically immersed in water and they don't like it. Think about your water and oil, right? If you had a cup and you put water and oil into it, they're going to completely separate. The oil separates completely from the water, doesn't like the water. So what happens if you have a cell where these fatty acid tails want to separate from the water? What you're going to have is complete imbalance. So you're not going to have a stable environment, right? Things are going to be at homeostasis right now, right? There's not going to be stability because these fatty acid tails are going to want to go away. So they're going to move away from the water. They're going to go closer to the glycerol heads, and we're going to end up with a problem here. So this is not going to happen. I don't know if you just noticed it, but I had a glycerol head, a phospholipid like this, and I move the tails. Instead of going outward, it's going to start moving upward, right? To try to kind of maybe get closer to that glycerol head so that it doesn't have to touch the water, right? That would make for a very, very, very unstable environment. We don't want that. Well, the cell has a solution. Instead of these phospholipids kind of hanging out inside of the water, something's going to occur. When the cell membrane structure is created, there's going to be, I'm going to draw another layer of circles around. I'm not going to do this exact, but figure it's kind of going to be like, pretty much around. And these are also going to have its fatty acid tails. And if you notice something very interesting, these glycerol heads are in contact with the inside of the water. The fatty acid tails, however, where are they? The fatty acid tails are sandwiched in between the two glycerol heads. So let's just write this again. We have H2O on this side, we have H2O on this side, right? 70%. And so we have the glycerol heads on the inside facing the water. We have the glycerol heads on the outside facing the water. They're hydrophilic, they're happy, they like it. And we have the fatty acid tails kind of sandwiched in between. And that's what's gonna keep it stable, right? They're gonna kind of sandwich in between the two glycerol heads, and that way they don't contact, they're not in contact with the water and they're happy, okay? So the structure of the cell membrane is actually what we call a bilayer, right? Bilayer, which is 2 layers of phospholipids. Okay, so we have this bilayer, this double layer, these 2 layers of phospholipids, and that's what makes up our cell membrane, and that's what keeps everything nice and stable. All right, that's for today. I will see you back tomorrow.